أعوذ بالله السميع العليم من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا ونبينا أبي القاسم محمد وعلى آله الطيبين الطاهرين الذين أذهب الله عنهم الرجس وطهرهم تطهيرا. We're going to go over what last week because what we said was lost. In Tafsir of Quran, we have been talking about the Tafsir of the Prophet ﷺ, and we said the companions relied on four things, if you recall. The first was Quran itself. The second was the Prophet ﷺ's sayings, pronouncements. The third was their own ijtihad. And the fourth was Israeliyat, which is, a study of biblical literature. These are the four aspects of tafsir that were present at that time. As the time progressed after the Prophet, we'll go into details later on. As the time progressed after the Prophet, we had companions still alive after the Prophet. And then there came time of Tabi'in. These were those who had not seen the Prophet himself, but had seen the companions of the Prophet. The word Tabi'in is for them. And then came the time of Tabi'in. Those who had not seen the Prophet, those who had not seen the companions of the Prophet, but had seen Tabi'in of the Prophet. So that's another generation that came. At the same time, the Muslim world saw itself differences on various issues. The first century of Islam had not ended yet, and the differences were very visible. Some companions were still alive, but mostly the time was of Tabi'in. Then the companions of the Prophet had died, because most of the Prophet's elderly companions were of his age, in their 60s when the Prophet himself, passed away. In a decade or two, 3 decades, most of them either died naturally or died as a result of some battle where Muslim armies went and confronted the aggressors. As the time passed, as the century ended, we had very few companions left, most of them were Tabi'in. In this particular period, we see that Tabi'in had the only way to rely on the traditions, because they had not seen the Prophet. All they had seen was the companions. So what they could rely was on traditions. And they quoted from these traditions. Many of them, clear, and a lot of them ambiguous. And at the same time, they also started banking on the biblical literature. To get to know, for example, the story of Genesis, for example, the creation of the world, the heavens and earth, the beginning of the rivers, so as to say, the story of Shaddad, for example, the story of Ad and Thamud, for example, and things like that. In many such matters, they relied heavily on either traditions or Israeliyat. And hence we see that a lot of literature regarding tafsir about these realities comes from Israeliyat and reliance on traditions. After passing away of Ali ibn Abi Talib, particularly, when the Umayyad rule was firmly entrenched in the Muslim world, fabrication of traditions became norm. And hence you see a lot of things which will otherwise not appeal to a conscious mind being a part of the literature. As the expansion of Muslim power was ensured in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, neighboring countries were conquered, the Muslims came in contact with other civilizations, with vanquished people, so as to say, various religions and sects. This gave rise to theological discourses, arguments between Muslims and others. gave rise to a field of knowledge that we collectively call as Ilm al-Kalam. In Ilm al-Kalam itself, coupled with the Greek mythology that was translated into Arabic from Roman and Greek sources, the discourses regarding tafsir also became intense. Many times, arguments based on Ilm al-Kalam, arguments based on Greek mythology came into play. Also, the taste for philosophical underpinnings of things became very common. Simultaneously, tasawwuf emerged in the Muslim world. Here was a group of people who wanted the real Islam. And by real Islam, they meant the direct link with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and nothing else. And this, they thought, could be achieved through severe self-discipline, rigorous lifestyle, disowning everything around them, and disdain for society and its inherents. As worldly people, and we looking for something divine. As the world being physical, and we looking for something that's spiritual. As the world being material, and we looking for something higher, so as to say. All these emerging groups, the philosophers, the theological scientists, the Sufis, all of them were looking to Quran as fundamental source for their beliefs. Because they knew for sure that traditions could be disputed, historical events could have more than one interpretation. But as far as Quran was concerned, those words were the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, a divine revelation, and hence the possibility of any alteration non-existent. And one had to subscribe to that to portray oneself as a Muslim. If you oppose Quran, you would not exist as a Muslim. So this became an intense battle. The last part of the first century and the first part of the second century, and more in the middle of the second century, the Muslim society being split in various groups, each trying to claim authenticity from Quran itself. So the theologians, the philosophers, the Sufis, and those traditionalists, all of them presenting Quran as to establish their own legitimacy. So there was an intellectual chaos then. And the tafasir emerging at this time reflected chaos. It seemed that as far as discussions were concerned, the only thing Muslims were committed to was La ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah, and the rest was debatable. The people of traditions, those who relied heavily on traditions, explained the Quran with the traditions they were, attributed to the Prophet ﷺ, and more to their companions of the Prophet and their disciples. Very strange. Now Malik, who is one of the great scholars, of all times, one of the four Aimna, whose book, Muwatta, is the first book of traditions, much before Bukhari. He was of the opinion that the Sunnah, the word Sunnah itself,